Welcome to the Guy with the Hooks Storytime, the place where stories come to life amidst the rhythm of needle and thread. In this podcast, I read my own written stories. Sometimes they're exciting, sometimes mysterious, sometimes warm and peaceful, and sometimes romantic. But they have one thing in common. Somewhere in the story, the soft tapping of knitting needles or the gentle rhythm of a crochet hook always resonates. The stories you hear are entirely fictional. They are not based on real events, although they could easily take place anywhere, perhaps even closer than you think. My native language is Dutch, so it could be that the way I speak or pronounce is a bit differently. My apologies for that in advance. In this first story, we begin at the Veluwe, place of vast forests, misty heathlands, and quiet paths where almost no one comes at night. But according to some hikers, the Veluwe is less empty at night than it seems. Today you'll listen to a ghost story about a ghostly appearance, an unexpected encounter in the dark, and the soft sound of tapping needles that seems to float through the forest. So grab your crochet or knitting work, settle in comfortably, grab a drink, and listen on, because this is the sage of the night spinner. The Legend of the Night Spinner. Episode 1. The Whisper in the Forest. Night held the Veluwe in its icy grip. Mist slid over the moss and dead pine needles, like a breath that never ceased. The wind seemed to whisper between the trees, and every shadow seemed to move, as if the forest itself were alive. Paths, normally familiar, seemed treacherous, winding, and sometimes completely gone tonight. Joris walked alone through the forest, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He was an experienced hiker who often only set out in the evening for a scenic trek through the woods. He was accustomed to the sound of the forest and its inhabitants, who dared to emerge in the darkness after the bustle of the day. Joris was confident and fearless compared to many who would take an evening walk, but something felt different this evening. His shoes crunched softly over fallen leaves, and every time he thought he heard the sound of an owl, it seemed to vanish, as if it had never been there. Yet he felt it, a presence. Suddenly, he saw a flash of something white among the trees. It was a woman, a tall, pale figure with long hair that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. She moved slowly, almost floating. In her hands she held something that glittered into the dim light. Joris thought it was a knife at first, but then he saw the thin, sharp points, knitting needles, old iron knitting needles gleaming in the light of a damp mist. His heart beat faster. He wanted to say something, but his voice seemed stuck. The woman looked up, and her eyes, they seemed empty, yet filled with something he couldn't name. A breath of wind brought a scent of wet sheep's wool and earth, old and musty, straight to his nose. Joris felt a chill run down his spine. Then he heard the icy whisper, "Do you want me to spin for you?" The words were soft, but they crawled across his skin like tiny spiders searching for a way up. Joris wanted to leave, but his legs didn't move. He seemed frozen, rooted to the spot. His eyes followed the movement of her hands. She tucked her knitting needles away in a leather pouch hanging beside her cloak. Slowly, her hands made circular motions and a thread seemed to emerge from the mist, slowly twisting in the air, as if it were breathing and alive. As he watched, he seemed to see the thread drift across the ground toward him and touch his feet. Not hard, not painful, But something deep inside him told him it was too late, that he was trapped, as if the thread had connected with his soul through its touch. And then, a flash of memory. It had been years ago, in a small house on the edge of the forest at the Veluwe. There she lived, a young woman, with eyes full of dreams and hands always creating. She was quiet, lonely, but her world was filled with the spinning of the finest wool and the rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles. Every evening she sat by the window, knitting scarves and sweaters, talking to her own hands as if they were friends. She laughed often, softly, as she counted the stitches of a pattern no one else understood. Sometimes neighbors would come by and invite her in for a coffee or tea, but she always quickly fled back to her house, her safe world of yarn and stitches. There was something magical about her work, something that made you silent just looking at it. And there was something else, something dark, a resentment that slowly grew in her heart, and anger that would haunt her long after her death. Joris was startled out of the memory. The fog around him seemed thicker, almost tangible. The thread, thin but unmistakably, slowly began to wrap itself around his ankles. His breath caught, and a fear he'd never felt before crept through his chest. Once again he heard her say, "Do you want me to spin for you?" The whisper repeated, closer now, all around him as if the entire Veluwe carried the voice. Joris tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. His heart pounded in his ears. Then, just when he thought it was over, he felt something cold caress his shoulder. He turned slowly, and there she stood, fully visible now, her eyes hollow but alive, her hands playing with the air, where a thin thread began to grow, wriggling like a snake. The last thought he had flashed through his mind before the fog swallowed him all was that he should never have gone walking alone. Not on a night like this, where the forest whispered, and someone else, someone with no life left, still waited. And then there was only the fog. This story continues in the next episode. Will you still keep listening?